so today we're talking about ways to help ensure success of a statistical project. I think it's quite often the case that statistical results, when they're reported to people, they're often just not that convincing. Um, I think there's always kind of ambiguity, and there's not sort of a direct proof that the result really matters or means something to that person or that individual. Uh, and this could be for a number of different reasons. It might be the design of the study. It might be um, nuances in the data. It might be all these different special cases that you can always kind of nitpick and tear apart. But ultimately, you can't really see the value in what they're being presented. And so um, the goal of this blog post was really to uh, think of ways to help get a little bit closer and instill confidence to realizing more sort of tangible impact, something that you can kind of see immediately that the information we're garnering with this project, and with our statistics and our data collection and everything involved is actually leading to some sort of tangible outcome that we hoped for. All right, so number one, assemble your team early. So I think with really any project in any context, it just makes sense to think that, well, anybody who's going to be involved or have a role to play at some point should probably be involved at the beginning in some capacity in terms of planning and design and all those things, so that everybody really has a say and kind of has some sort of idea of where the project's going to go. Everybody plays their own sort of role. They all know things that everybody else doesn't know about specifically what they need to do. And so really just getting everybody involved early while the project's being designed is going to really enhance the likelihood of success. And I think this is probably one of the most important ones. And so specifically in statistics, it's really often the case that a statistician gets brought in much later in the project after different stakeholders or whoever has already kind of discussed the project. They've laid out the research questions. They even go and collect the data, and then they pass the data to the statistician and say, hey, can you analyze this for me? Well, the statistician doesn't necessarily know anything about the context. They have to kind of relearn, well, what questions were you asking in the first place? How did you actually go about collecting the data? And oftentimes they'll find that when you ask those questions, there are some inefficiencies or even some things that come up where, well, we can't actually answer that question because of how the data was collected. And had the statistician known that at the beginning, we could have planned the design appropriately to actually be able to answer the research question. And so it's not just the statistician that needs to be involved early, but really everybody. So, you're all on the same page. And the other thing I'll add is, especially when, if you're doing something like a operational predictive model where you're actually trying to integrate predictive solutions into the business workflows and things like that, it's also a really good idea to have people like the end users involved at the very beginning, instead of saying, hey people, we just designed this predictive model, now use it in your workflow. Instead, you bring them in at the beginning and help them design, or let them design the solution, or be a big part of it, which actually will guide kind of the optimal sort of solution that's going to provide the most value, because they're the ones actually using it. And all of those things can definitely have impact on the statistics, what sort of methods you use, and everything. So yeah, really just everybody who's going to be involved at some point, get them at the table as early as possible, and I think the chances of success are already going to increase drastically at that point. Okay, number 2, make the goals clear, then plan accordingly. So we have everybody at the table now, and so now the question is, well, what do we really want to accomplish? And by this I don't necessarily mean stating vague goals like, oh, we just want to know if there's a relationship between X and Y. I think when we start getting into the territory of these kind of vague statistical relationships and things like that, that kind of causes sort of an endless loop of analysis paralysis and data fatigue, because when you start asking vague questions, you're going to get vague answers. You're going to just start looking at the data and not really have any sort of direction or rhyme or reason for the plots you're making. Not to say that the stuff you come up with isn't interesting or useful in some way, but it kind of slows down the progress, and you don't really know what you're after. And so I like to think of having kind of 2 layers of goals, and the first really being this kind of ultimate outcome, right? What is the big thing that we want to make a difference in? And so, right, that might be, say, like, oh, we want to impact revenue, or some sort of patient outcome, or something like that. And then you start to think of, okay, well, now what sort of levers are we going to pull to impact that outcome? And then you start kind of narrowing it down to a place where you can define an actual statistical problem that is focused on kind of a particular set of questions. And so you might be able to now say, okay, we want to build a predictive tool that predicts the likelihood of this outcome, and implement it in this way into our workflow, because down the road we hope that that's going to lead to some sort of change in that ultimate outcome of interest. And so you kind of lay it out all out there in this kind of statistical quantitative terms that we can actually test and see with our data, but then we also bridge the gap to think about how we're going to connect those results to the ultimate outcome, or that tangible outcome that we really are interested in. Okay, number 3, think about taking action. This is probably my favorite one to think about. It's really about thinking of, what are you actually going to do about some sort of information that you're going to get from a project. So you go out and collect data, you build a statistical model, and you get some sort of, say, parameter estimates or whatever it is about the context. And the question is, okay, what am I actually going to do once I know this information? This should be stuff you're thinking about before you even start the project. Again, in that planning phase, you can kind of think hypothetically. If I see these results, here's what we can now do about it. Or if we see these results, we might be able to do something else. And so I think it helps orient the project towards kind of some sort of actionable solution, as opposed to, again, just going and sifting through data to find interesting results, but there's not any sort of roadmap of where it's going to go, or what's going to happen as a result. So when you think about kind of what action or decisions you can actually make as a result of the project, you start to actually shape the full solution. So you start to think about even like technological constraints about, well, say I want to build a predictive model and that's what I think I want, and then you start thinking what I'm actually going to do about it. Well, then you start thinking about, well, how is this actually going to fit into our systems? What sort of technical constraints do I need to resolve or get through in order to enable, say, just from like a pure computation perspective, to enable a model to run through our systems automatically to deliver a number to somebody to then do something about it. Or maybe resource constraints is like who is actually going to be the one to take action and when. And I think that all of those things are going to drastically help you develop kind of a full-fledged data solution or product and kind of define the end goal, and develop the roadmap of how you're going to get there, because you don't want to get to the end and have a statistical result and then you're stuck like, okay, what do we do now? It's like, no, we thought about that at the beginning and we actually oriented our project towards that. And when we do think about the actions we're going to take, that actually might impact the actual math or the statistical model we choose to answer the question in the first place, right? Because if the thing that's going to be most optimal to actually take action has say constraint X, that might need to be accounted for in our modeling approach in some way that's going to actually impact kind of what sort of model I run. That, you know, if we didn't think of that, we wouldn't have had that constraint, or we might have had a completely different statistical approach that you know, may have seemed similar on the surface, but really it's doing something completely different. And so I think my favorite way to summarize this one is just thinking about ahead of time is kind of the question to ask yourself is, if I knew X at time Y, then I could do Z. And the question is, what are X, Y, and Z? So if I knew kind of some sort of statistical data point or some sort of information that I don't know at a particular time when I need to know it, here's what that will enable me to do. And then, so then you can say, okay, well now how can we design a project that's going to help us answer that and fill in those blanks. Okay, number 4, create a tangible product. So I think in statistics, we rarely are thinking and discussing about like the actual tangible end product that we are delivering at the end. There's so much focus and time and energy spent on the math and the statistics, and rightly so. That's obviously where the fruit of the labor is, and that's what needs to be accurate, obviously, to get something out of it. But I think thinking of what the end product is going to look like, and I think in detail, or as detailed as you can, so you really can have a roadmap again towards something, kind of towards an end goal, so you don't get lost in the endless cycle of repeat analysis or just kind of exploring data over and over. It's like, no, here's the questions we're answering, and here is how I know that I'm done. And it's, say, this report that's going to look like this, and it's going to have these contents in them, or it's kind of this model that's in this system facilitating some sort of predictive modeling workflow, but here are kind of the specifications of it, or of how it's actually going to work, the plumbing and everything like that. But again, it's kind of just thinking about like what's the thing you're going to touch and feel at the end that's going to represent kind of the final product of what you're doing. So you know that you're done. All right, and last but not least, number 5, answer the question, did it work? So this one's not necessarily the most straightforward one to facilitate, but I think it's a really important one to think about how you're going to evaluate and if you can, like make a plan to do it and include it as part of the project. So you go through the statistical analysis. Say you build a model and you get some sort of effect estimate and say, well, the odds of say some outcome for these patients is 2 times the odds for this patient, and it's like, okay, and it might be all believable, but you still are missing something. You're missing kind of the actual impact of that new information. It's like, okay, so we have this new information about, say, this treatment or whatever it is, and yeah, we're kind of confident that it's right and everything, but we still haven't used that information to our advantage yet. And so, how are we going to actually know that kind of what we've now learned is paying off at the end? And so, thinking about kind of mechanisms for tracking and maintaining, kind of again going back to previous points, like that ultimate outcome that we were interested in. Did we actually improve that thing as a result of this endeavor and this project? And so this is sort of a tough one to think about in the context of like just statistical estimation and things like that. And it's probably more straightforward when you're thinking about like a predictive model being operationalized, because I don't know, just from a technical perspective, it's easier to conceptualize like, okay, we're putting this thing into the system, now we're going to track kind of some sort of metrics, because we kind of have some sort of workflow tailored, and we kind of know what things we expect to change and things like that. But if we're kind of just reporting like some sort of treatment effect from some research study, it's kind of harder to think about this. But I think it's still important to think about it, because again, even if we find some interesting statistical result and we believe it to be true and it all makes sense, nothing has really happened yet until it's used to our advantage for some downstream decision or action. And so, at the very least, something to keep in mind and include in the discussion is how are we going to know if this was useful or not?